Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Parallax Abstraction, and welcome to another episode of Retro Flashback, showcasing gaming's roots for a new generation. So, I was trying to think about something to play for this episode. I've got a list of stuff I want to cover, but nothing was really connecting with me, so I was kind of like, well, what can I do? And I was sort of looking through the games I have available to me, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember Pinbot for the NES. This was kind of neat in its day, and this could be kind of a fun thing to talk about. So, that's what I decided to do today. So this is what we're taking a look at. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with pinball very much, Pinbot, well, it's one of my personal favorite pinball tables of all time, and it is sort of one of the iconic ones from the 80s, to be sure. It was put out by Williams originally, and everybody sort of has their own memories of pinball games, but my memory of this was they used to have a surprisingly good arcade at the Ottawa International Airport, of all things, back in the 80s. And my dad used to travel for work a lot, so when my mom and I would go to pick him up when he would come back from his trips, I used to get a few bucks to spend in the arcade while we waited for his flight to arrive, and this is what I spent a lot of money on. This is a pretty awesome pinball table, and the story of how this came to the NES is kind of weird, or at least the history is. This was actually developed by Rare, which is a very well-known British developer that actually still exists to this day. And man, I am bombing this in my first run of this. Rare still exists to this day. They are currently a subsidiary of Microsoft, doing kind of not much, to be honest with you, at least not much of any real note, which is kind of unfortunate. But they made, historically, some really incredible games, especially on the NES. And for some reason, something came about where they decided to get the license from Williams to do an NES video version of the Pinbot table, and Nintendo actually published it as well, which is the amazing part. So we have a British-developed, Japanese-published version of an American-designed pinball machine, which is really kind of interesting. But it is a pretty faithful reproduction, and I thought it would be fun to talk about this just to sort of see how video pinball kind of worked in this day, because getting reproductions of actual active arcade tables was not a very common thing back in this era. And this was kind of a pretty impressive thing at the time. And I remember putting many hours into the NES version of Pinbot just because I love this table so very much. And that's the interesting thing. If you want to play Pinbot now, kind of in its more authentic form, it is actually available as part of the Pinball Arcade collection that Farsight Studios has put out and is still actively adding to. And that is available on just about any friggin' platform you can think of. It's available on, like, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, PlayStation Vita, iOS, Android, Mac. It's coming to PC pretty soon. I think there's a version coming for the 3DS and the Wii U at some point as well. It's crazy. And this was one of the sort of original tables in that collection. So you can sort of see it in its original version on that, and it's a very good reproduction. So I guess the main question here is, what are the principal differences between this version and the original arcade one? Well, aside from the fact that it's actually easier to play than I'm making it look out to be here, this is a pretty good reproduction. Now, purists don't necessarily like this game a whole lot versus the original, because being a video pinball game... Okay, first off, there's a really cool thing. We'll get to that. Being a video pinball game, you can take creative liberties, shall we say, that you wouldn't necessarily be able to in the real world due to, well, the fact that pinball games are mechanical and you have to stay within the laws of physics. And what the purists kind of didn't like about this game was that as you progress further in, and I don't remember getting that far on a frequent basis, but the sort of color scheme of the table will change, and the game will actually eventually introduce enemies that sort of come across the play field and are there to basically interfere with the progression of your ball. That was something that obviously didn't exist in the man, I am sucking at this. I had a really good run of this when I was doing my tests for this video, but man, I am bombing it now. So it had those enemies, and yeah, a lot of people didn't like that. It's kind of an interesting thing. I think it's kind of cool, but yeah, if you really want the sort of fully authentic arcade reproduction of this game, well, there are some differences there. And the other big thing is, obviously, given that this was an 8-bit console, I mean, as you can see, the color scheme on this is fairly limited. I mean, the Pinbot table did like a lot of neon colors and stuff, which this does, but it is a little gaudy to look at, perhaps. And also the ball physics in this, which is, of course, one of the most key elements when you're trying to reproduce a pinball table. They're definitely not the same as the arcade version, and they're not really realistic, though they're also not particularly bad either. The problem with this, for the most part, is that the pinball has too much weight to it. It's very, very heavy. It's very sort of... I don't know what the right adjective is, but when you hit the ball, it feels like you're shooting something that is a lot larger and a lot heavier than a traditional pinball would be, and that's kind of a hard thing to wrap your head around. I don't tend to mind that too much in video. Yeah, that's awesome. I don't tend to mind that too much in video pinball games because it's really just a different way of playing the game, and once you sort of get yourself accustomed to how the ball controls, you can sort of maximize your play based on whatever weight it has. So, not a huge deal, but again, not truly authentic. They also pulled off some pretty amazing technical feats with that, which, as you heard there at the beginning, you have the actual Pinbot voice. Now, one of the things that really used to impress the heck out of people with the original arcade pinball of this game was that it had a voice synthesizer in it, which when this originally came out was far out future tech at that point. A game that could speak even in a weird, like, distorted robot voice was incredibly impressive in that era. And speech synthesis was very uncommon on the NES because it was very technically hard to do given the limitations of the hardware, but Rare actually pulled it off here. And I can definitely say that adds a lot to the authenticity. If this didn't have that voice reproduction, it wouldn't have the same soul as the arcade game, because Pinbot without the voice is just not the same thing. It really isn't. And you'll hear that at various different points when it's called for in the game, like when you get the visor open and things like that. You'll get the voice samples from that. The game does pause while it speaks them out, which I'm sure was just a technical limitation. It's not really that annoying. It doesn't really break things that much. It doesn't really screw up immersion or cause unnecessary difficulty. Some people might not like it. It doesn't bother me that much. So kind of what's the objective here? Well, I mean, this is pinball, right? So pinball is all about getting score and maximizing your score however you can. And, I mean, some pinball games have their weird attempt at story or whatever, but the real goal with this is that it's not really clear to me... Alright, there we go. So it's not really clear to me if you're actually working with or against Pinbot, but your goal is to get to the sun, basically, to go through the solar system, jump between various planets, and eventually get to the sun, and the more planets you get, the more points you get. That's kind of the idea of it, and there's various different ways to do that. I'm not going to sort of explain how the game works. You can read up on that if you want, but... Okay. Oh, listen to that rockin' score. So, there's the sort of key, biggest scoring mechanic in the game. So, you'll see that there's this lit grid, that lit colorized... there's that lit colorized grid in front of the Pinbot visor. So, the key to this, as is the case with most pinball games, your biggest scoring opportunity is to activate multi-ball. And the way you do that in this game is you have to hit each of the targets in front of those colored squares up there enough times to light the whole thing up. When the whole thing lights up, the visor opens, and then you have to put a... I waited too long. You have to put a pinball into each of the two halves, and when you do that, it triggers multi-ball, which basically sends your score through the roof because you're scoring twice as much. So you see I reached Pluto. Now those planet bonuses are permanent throughout the course of your play session or throughout your game session. So if you get, say, 3 or 4 planets into the solar system, that's a bonus that you'll get on every subsequent ball until you game over. So that's kind of a nice little bonus as well. And yeah, if you're able to get the multi-ball and hold on to it, you will get a substantial number of points. Ugh. And hopefully you don't suck like I do. It's funny how when I sit down to start recording, that's all of a sudden when my skill goes out the window. Always happens that way. So that's the sort of core idea of Pinbot. And like any pinball table, you know, the more you play it, you can sort of min-max your score and sort of employ strategies and strategic hits of the ball to sort of target it towards certain high-scoring targets. And that's really ultimately what you want to do here. And there are plenty of opportunities to do that in this game. And it's pretty good. I mean, the way you play the game is a little bit odd, but it really works fairly well. The way you trigger the left paddle here is by hitting any of the 4 directions on the cross pad on the NES controller, and then you trigger the right one by pressing the B button, and the A button does nothing except launch your ball. That's all it does. So it's fairly simplistic controls, and here's the other weird part. It's kind of interesting to me that this actually came out on the NES like this. So one of the key things about pinball, or the sort of key strategic moves that you want to use to try to save your ball, is tilting. And tilting is very simple. Tilting is doing that. It's shaking the table and trying to alter the path in which your ball is traveling so as to avoid it going out or to aim it towards a better scoring target. So how do you do that? Well, because in pinball you need the ability to tilt in 2 directions, right? Depending on how you want the ball to go, you either want to nudge the table on the left side or the right side. And the way you do that in Pinbot on the NES is with the start and select buttons. So select does that, start does that. So you see it sort of goes in the two different directions there. Now you may be asking yourself, if you're doing math in your head, well, wait a minute, I just went over all the buttons on the controller, so how do you pause? Yep, you don't. This is one of the few NES games out there that actually has no pause function whatsoever, which is incredibly strange. I mean, if there is a pause function, maybe it's some weird combination of buttons that I never learned, but as far as I know, there's no way to pause this game, which is incredibly weird, and maybe I'm wrong, but I thought Nintendo required that all games have a pause function, so maybe they either didn't require that and it was just sort of commonly done by all developers anyway, or maybe Nintendo, because Nintendo published this game, they gave themselves an exception to the rule, or I don't know. But it's really, really weird that you can't pause this game, and kind of a pain, because if you've got a really good run going in this game, having to, you know, getting interrupted and having to sort of walk away from it and basically letting yourself game over kind of sucks. Kind of sucks. It's really strange, and I don't know why they did that. The other weird oddity as well versus the traditional pinball table is what you can do as well is if you nudge the table too often, you will hit what's called tilting. And what tilting was basically a mechanic designed to stop people from physically abusing pinball tables too much. So if the table detected... There we go. Love this metal truck. And the solar value is ultimately what you want to increase here. That's a value in the game that is sort of the main jackpot bonus. So you want to build that up. So yeah, what would normally happen is if the machine detected that you were tilting too much, it would basically go, all right, you've gone too far, and it would shut your flippers off and make your ball go out, and you'd lose a ball for tilting too much. And the way you wanted to do that was you wanted to use tilt sparingly and strategically as a result. But in this game, there is no tilting out. Look at that. I am earthquaking the living crap out of this machine, and nothing is happening. That's really weird. I don't know why they did that, or at least didn't make that a toggle. I mean, sure, this is video pinball. You're not physically damaging a machine. Oh, there we go, and I brought out the enemies. All right. So you can see what's going on here. So you see that little blob we have on the screen right there. That obviously was not in the original arcade game, and a lot of people didn't like that because the purpose of that thing is to try to eat and disrupt your ball. And it's kind of funny and cute. I think it's kind of neat. It's, you know, it's a neat little adaptation on it, but much like the ability to tilt the table or not, it would be better if... Oh, he's gone hostile on me. It would be nice if that could be turned off. Like, if you just wanted to play traditional pinball, or pinbot, I should say, you know, to just be able to say, hey, put no enemies on the table, just make this about high scoring in the default environment, and also the ability to say, hey, make it so that I could tilt the table or not. I would think those wouldn't have been very hard options to implement, and it kind of would have been nice if they did that. I mean, it's, you know, I think this is okay, but it's... I can see why pinball purists, and believe me, pinball purists are out there and they are hardcore. I could see why they would be disappointed that that wasn't there. But it's a pretty good reproduction of Pinbot, this. It's really weird how this happened. I would love to know the history about how this particular version of it came to be, because Nintendo didn't really do pinball games. Neither did Rare, for that matter. And, you know, this is a licensed game that came out when the pinball table was still in active service. So they probably spent a good chunk of money. Oh, there's some nice bonus. They probably spent a good chunk of money to get the license from Williams to be able to produce this. And they did it for some reason, and Nintendo was like, yeah, let's put this out there. This kind of feels like the kind of thing where, like, Chris and Tim Stamper, who were the original founders of Rare and sort of the guys who ran the show there for a long time, kind of sounds like maybe this was something where they loved Pinbot and they were just like, oh man, we really want to bring this out on a home console, and it was kind of one of their little pet projects that they maybe shopped around, and because of Rare's relationship with Nintendo, they were able to pull some strings and make some calls and make this happen. But it's really cool. I mean, it's not perfect by any means. I mean, the color scheme is a little and though they do their best to reproduce the score from the game, and they do it with these sort of like technological sort of drony sound samples that are kind of robotic, I guess, in nature. The music's a little grating. I mean, Rare used music stylings like this in a lot of their NES games, and I don't know. It doesn't really grab me. I mean, it definitely sounds spacey and, like I said, sort of robotic, and that's cool, but it'll grate on you after a while, especially with the fact that you've probably been hearing once in a while this sort of whiny, drony, high-pitched sample that just randomly kicks in sometimes, and that's something the game did. And it sounds almost like they're trying to make the NES sound chip do too many things at once. See, there's the random kick-ins like that. That's a normal function of the game, and it can get kind of annoying after a while. I mean, the NES could only produce a limited number of sounds at once, and it really sounds like just at times they were trying to push the console to do more than it was capable of, and it kind of got confused. That's kind of a shame. I don't know, I think the sound could have been done a little bit better, and while I do like that they tried to retain sort of a neonish art style to go along with the game, I think it is a little bright and a little overwhelming at times. I think they maybe could have toned it down a little bit more, but really those are minor complaints overall for what is a very faithful reproduction of Pinbot. And given the technological limitations that they were under at the time, you know, recreating a real-life mechanical table on 8-bit hardware is not an easy task to do with any kind of accuracy, and they pulled it off. The physics are a little different, and yeah, they added their own twist that you can maybe take or leave, but they did a pretty good job, I think. The game does have multiplayer. All that is a pass-and-play mode where you basically can have up to 4 people playing, and everybody can just compete to get better score. So it's not like a simultaneous co-op or competitive kind of thing. I don't even know how you do that, to be honest. It's nice that the options there really doesn't make a huge amount of difference. I mean, when my friends and I used to play this a lot when we were younger, we used to prefer to actually pick one player and just pass the controller after each ball and just see who could contribute the most to the sort of, screwed that up. See who could contribute the most to a single score. We thought that was a little bit more fun, so. But I think this is pretty cool. You can't find this version in any digital format that I'm aware of. If you want to actually play the NES version of Pinbot, you're going to have to find yourself a cartridge. But to be honest with you, the best way to play this game is to just pick up the Pinball Arcade on your device of choice and play their insanely accurate reproduction of the original table. The Pinball Arcade strives for accuracy, and it's done by a group of dudes who clearly love pinball and really understand it as well. So you're going to get the sort of essential, ultimate Pinbot experience if you play it through that. But I thought it would be a neat idea to show the NES version just because, as I said, video pinball games weren't super common back in this era, and they definitely weren't, ones based on real tables pretty much didn't exist. There were very, very few of them. Nice. And it was really odd that this thing happened. It was basically, like I said, a British developer decided to do a reproduction of a still in active service American pinball table, and it was published by Nintendo. Didn't see that happen very much. So I think that's kind of cool. But yeah, that is Pinbot, published by Nintendo and developed by Rare in 1990 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's pretty cool. If you're looking to experience Pinbot, or if this has made you interested in Pinbot, there are better ways to do it. But I think this is a neat little showcase of kind of something that was a little unique for its time, and how a company who really knew how to make the NES do some interesting stuff was able to do something I think few others could have at the time. My name has been Parallax Abstraction. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.